We will start by introducing the panel and the moderators. I will start with myself. I'm a surgeon. I'm a professor of surgery and a director emeritus and founder of the transplant program at Columbia. Next is Dr. Karin Hehenberger, who is the CEO of Lyfebulb, and both a physician and a PhD, so that she's very qualified and organ recipient. Dr. Lloyd Ratner is the director of transplantation and of kidneys and pancreas at Columbia University. He's professor of surgery. Mr. Brian Runge is the chief coordinator for donors at this time. Dr. Geoffery Dube is assistant professor of medicine and one of our senior nephrologists on the transplant service. Gretchen Boyd is the chief coordinator for the renal and pancreas transplant programs at Columbia.
It's really a privilege for us, for Lyfebulb, to be working with Columbia on this effort focused on patient education. 13 years ago, I was in this position waiting for a transplant. I was very much in this role of exploring what to do when you're at end-stage renal disease, in my case. And I was very lucky to have a person who knew Dr. Ratner and put me in touch with him, but that's not always the case. So I'm going to ask Dr. Ratner, how does it normally happen, or is my case a case that is normal?
The first criteria for getting a transplant is being able to show up. You have to be able to get to your transplant center, not just for the transplant, but also for the extensive follow-up care that's necessary afterwards. So if a center is too far away or you have difficulty getting there, that's sort of the first criteria. Now, fortunately, here in New York, we're blessed with a lot of really good transplant centers. Now, obviously, we have a bias that we think we're the best, but the reality is that most transplant centers in the United States are pretty good. And have excellent results. And if you look at the quality of outcomes with transplant across the country, they're all pretty close. Now, what differs quite a bit is how many people actually get transplanted, how long they have to wait, and the percentage of transplants that come from living donors vary quite a bit. So first is, if you have a living donor, I would go to a place that does a lot of live donor transplants. You want to make sure your donor gets taken care of as well. Second is what percentage of people actually get transplanted and how long do they have to wait? And then finally, do you get along with the people? Do you like them? Are they do you have are you able to have a rapport with them? Do they answer your questions, or do they treat you sort of just as another, sort of a generic patient? So I think those are some of the things that you need to look for when assessing a transplant program.
Our transplant patients are part of an extended family, and so you kind of meet all the members of the family when you come in for the evaluation. You want to find a place where you feel comfortable, because you're going to be spending a lot of time there. You'll get to know your pre-transplant team very well as they shepherd you through the process, and you're going to know your post-transplant team very well as well. You're going to be spending a lot of time with them, and so having that comfort level and feeling like they're listening to you, your questions are getting answered, I think plays a large role in terms of deciding which center is best for you.
People with kidney disease can either self-refer, meaning you can reach out to a transplant center yourself. You don't have to have a physician do it for you. So some patients just contact the transplant center directly, either via phone or we at our center have an online questionnaire that a patient would fill out, or your physician can do it for you, or sometimes the social worker at the dialysis center. We always encourage patients to go to the SRTR website. The data for all transplant centers and our outcomes are readily available on the SRTR website. It's public data. You can go on and see, what is the outcomes of these different transplant centers to judge for yourself, where am I most likely to get, the care that I'm looking for.
Particularly if you have some unusual or difficult problems, not every transplant center will be willing or up to tackling that. If someone gets turned down by one transplant center, it doesn't mean that they would necessarily be turned down or discouraged by another transplant center. Patients are allowed to be on the list at multiple transplant centers. It is frequently in the patient's best interest to be multiply listed. And the same is true. Centers will have different criteria for who could donate a kidney or not. So just because someone is turned down by one center as a donor doesn't mean they would necessarily be turned down by all centers as a donor. So those are kind of things where it's worth looking into, particularly, like I said, if you have a difficult or unusual problem.
The outcomes with kidney transplant from living donor are significantly better than the outcomes with deceased donors. Obviously the kidney is coming from someone who is both alive and healthy enough to donate a kidney. And so what we see is those kidneys work better from the start. They have fewer short-term complications. The initial hospital stay is shorter. They have fewer long-term complications. They work better over the long term. On average, they last about twice as long as kidneys from deceased donors. So whenever possible, a kidney from a living donor should be considered the optimal treatment for kidney failure. However, because of the long waiting times for deceased donor kidneys, it's not always possible to get what we call a preemptive kidney transplant from a deceased donor. There's obviously no waiting list if your family member or your friend wants to donate their kidney to you. And so ideally, you identify a living donor who is able to donate to you either directly or through a paired kidney exchange. If you show up initially and you haven't identified a living donor, we can put you on the waiting list. You can start gaining waiting time for a deceased donor kidney. And at any point in time, if somebody comes forward and wants to donate to you, then by all means, you bring them in, get them evaluated, and we can still get you that living donor transplant.
Everyone, whether it's a living donor or a recipient, especially recipients, should bring their support because they're meeting with social workers and possibly therapists or psychiatrists for an evaluation. And a lot of information is thrown at these individuals all in one day. And we, of course, don't expect them to remember it all. And that's what coordinators also are here for. But there's so much, it can be overwhelming. So to have a second person or even a third or just the whole family, if they want to come in, we recommend everyone is, come in. I love when a group comes in. Bring food because a lot of transplant centers, we don't necessarily provide that. And just bring themselves, meaning be there with us because we're there teaching. We want everybody there to really try and get as much as they can because it is, again, overwhelming and there is a lot of info. You can move transplant centers. That is your right as a patient. Call your coordinator. Your coordinator will tell you exactly where you're at in the process, what you need to do, are you on a list, and what is being on the waiting list. It is a loose term to say, oh, I'm on the waiting list, because there's different types of listing. The waiting list is the United Network for Organ Sharing. That's the UNOS registry. Being on the list as a recipient means getting on the the kidney transplant waiting list to start either as a status 7 to start gaining waiting time, or as a status 1. That means you're active, cleared, been worked up at said transplant center, and you are now eligible to start receiving kidney organ offers. And if you're on dialysis, when you get listed, you get now your waiting time from when you started dialysis. So if you've been on dialysis for 20 years, you'll get 20 years of waiting time in your pocket. And that's a lot of waiting time.
We don't like to kick people off, but you can get kicked off the list. So, as time goes on, do the risks of transplant outweigh the benefits? So obviously we don't want to transplant someone and make them worse, but their illness could progress. They could develop new illnesses. And then, we have some patients who are non-adherent or non-compliant and don't do what's asked of them to continue to enable them to be a candidate or to be a good candidate for transplantation. Or once in a while, we get patients who are abusive to our staff. We think that's inappropriate. We don't take throwing anyone off the list lightly, and there are all kinds of procedures that have to be taken. But, if the benefits no longer outweigh the risks, if people prove that they don't do what's asked of them, where again, that becomes, if someone's not doing what they're supposed to do to get a transplant, will they do what they're supposed to do to take care of a transplant afterwards? And will they wind up wasting an organ because they don't take their medications or they don't come for follow-up visits?
At NYP Columbia, we don't like to limit ourselves to age cutoffs because there are those potential donors, a lot of transplant centers, living donor centers around the country that have maybe a 70-year-old cutoff. But there are some people that are over 70 and they're, in great shape. So we like to take it on a case-by-case basis. And that would just be something that we would bring to our selection committee, which is a multidisciplinary meeting of all the nephrologists, surgeons, social work, psychiatrists on the donor team, and say, hey, we have this donor questionnaire from this donor, this age, this medical history or no medical history. Would we consider moving forward? And there are times that we have, moved forward and been successful with some donors over the age of 70. But it also, you have to look at who they're donating to. If it's a younger person, maybe the kidney's not as good a functioning kidney because it's got some more miles on it, as Dr. Ratner loves to say. It's a used car, so it has more miles. It's not that it's not good, any good, because used cars are great, but maybe if it's a 30-year-old donor or recipient, they're going to need more transplants in their lifetime. So maybe we could potentially swap that donor with an older recipient who also then has a younger donor, and we do a cross swap.
In general, from the ethical standpoint, the donor's safety is paramount. And we could generally do the surgery and, leave the patient with one kidney so that they could live happily ever after if they've been through a very extensive evaluation and we've evaluated them for a whole host of things. But, in short, when we look at the donor and evaluate the donor, we want to make sure that, number one, that they'll be able to safely undergo surgery and anesthesia. Number two, that they'll be okay in the long term left with just one kidney. Number three, that they have two kidneys and that both of them are normal and that we get a roadmap for the surgery by doing the CAT scan. Number four, that they could give an informed consent. They're not being coerced, that they have realistic expectations, and that they don't have any sort of secondary gains expected. If things go wrong, either with themselves or the recipient, that they don't become pathologically depressed or anything like that. And that's why the donor evaluation is so extensive.
Kidneys from living donors will last roughly twice as long as kidneys from deceased donors on average. So, the average kidney from a living donor will last probably somewhere between 15 and 20 years. It's an average. Obviously, the younger and otherwise healthier you are at the time of transplant, the higher the likelihood that you'll be on the long side of the average. The average kidney from a deceased donor is probably more in the 6 to 10 year range, depending on the characteristics of the deceased donor. Kidneys from an older donor might not be expected to last as long as kidneys from a younger donor, or if the donor had some underlying medical conditions that might cause the kidneys maybe not to work quite as long, but about 6 to 10 years on average. But we can get a rough sense, from the time of transplant, based on the quality of the organ, kind of roughly how long on average we would expect that kidney to last. And I think it's important to note that regardless of whether you get a kidney from a living donor or a deceased donor, there is still a significant survival benefit compared with just staying on dialysis and never getting a transplant.
Don't try to screen out your own donors, right? Because I see in my experience, a lot of recipients will be like, oh, I have a donor, but they have high blood pressure, so they can't donate. Or they're not compatible to me, or I've been told they're not compatible, so they can't donate. Let us, as the transplant center, figure out, on a case-by-case basis, if that donor is going to be a good donor for you. Don't try to screen out your own donors, because 20 years ago, we probably weren't accepting donors with high blood pressure, but things change, and now we potentially could consider someone who's well controlled on one medication. Things change over time, safety considerations change, data changes, outcomes, guide us in our practice. So just don't ever try to screen out your own donors, because you might have a missed opportunity. Just whenever you have a donor or someone who's interested, either have them reach out to the transplant center, or you as the recipient, just touch base with your coordinator to find out if that's going to be a suitable donor for you.